Overwatch is totally in the gutter currently. Its player numbers have dropped to depressingly low numbers, and it seems like it's a well-known meme that the game is totally dying. But how exactly did we get here? There was a time where Overwatch had some of the most engaging lore in the gaming world, and the multiplayer experience was one of the more enjoyable ones on the market. Somehow Blizzard managed to take a game everyone loved and destroy it with a piss-poor sequel. But what exactly was the day Overwatch died? Today on Poseidon Films, we're going to explore the rise, fall, and finally the nail in the coffin for Overwatch as a series. Overwatch experienced its primary golden era from 2016 to 2018. This is when the concept was still new, and people were hyped to have another competitive game on the market other than Call of Duty. There was a time where Overwatch had an average player count in the hundreds of thousands. Now it's dwindled to just 20 to 30,000 players a day. The original copy sold over 50 million copies worldwide, making it 10th best-selling game of all time. This was also when the Overwatch League was in its peak, combining a strong casual scene with a developed pro scene. Sure, there were some balance issues, and every now and then the servers would go down a while, but for the most part, Overwatch players were loyal fans of the game. From 2016 to the day Overwatch 2 was announced in November of 2019, it remained in the 10 most popular online games with a steady ebb and flow of players. Even at its lowest player numbers, the original Overwatch was impossible to ignore in the gaming scene. The first real problem Overwatch ran into with its popularity was the fact they announced the sequel a bit earlier than needed to build efficient hype. I understand a lot of companies like to announce titles well in advance to really give it time to build fans, and that makes more sense with a game that isn't a sequel. But by announcing Overwatch 2 as early as they did, they set the fan expectations ridiculously high unnecessarily. Overwatch 2 really could have just been a huge update to the game, and people would have thought it fair. It really was not anything in terms of being an entirely new game. It really was like a refresh the way Counter-Strike recently received. By announcing it in 2019, fans expected that the sequel was actually going to bring groundbreaking changes to the game. The update Overwatch 2 ended up being was not something that it seemed would take 3 years to develop. By announcing it so far in advance, I think most Overwatch fans had an idea that this game was going to be a huge change, bringing lots of new features and balancing a lot of the current issues in a new way. Instead, when the sequel finally released, and it was more of a large update than a true sequel, it left a bad taste in most fans' mouths immediately. They simply hyped up the changes that were coming way too much compared to reality. For 3 years, rumors swirled around about how Overwatch 2 was going to basically cure all illness worldwide and also provide every player with a big gold bar. It doesn't help that every time Blizzard would let anything leak from the development team, they were doing nothing to temper expectations. Instead, they started to promise an entire PvE mode that would add an exceptional campaign experience on top of refreshing the multiplayer side entirely. People started to really look at Overwatch 2 as a potential way for Overwatch to become the biggest gaming franchise on the planet. The development team also continued to push this PvE mode myth more and more in their marketing. I know a lot of Overwatch fans never really cared about the PvE mode, but for some, it was one of the major reasons they were looking forward to the sequel. The marketing team continued to push promises of the solving of all major issues in the current game, and really did make it seem like this was going to solve all the franchise's problems. Now obviously, this did a good job of getting fans excited. After all, if you are a huge fan of a franchise and the team behind it starts promising an even better version of the game you already love, you'd be excited too. However, this hype would eventually come around to absolutely bite Blizzard right on the behind. Like Taco Bell coming to take revenge the next morning, this hype would rear its ugly head the closer the game got to its release. Remember that they started to announce these changes and make promises 3 years before the sequel actually released. I understand game development can be complicated, but the closer the game got to release, the more they realized the hole they had put themselves into. Suddenly, PvE was not going to be a part of the game at launch. A lot of the updates and quality of life improvements wouldn't be shipping with the sequel either. Obviously, this was disappointing to a lot of fans. After all they had been promised for 3 years, it would be a part of the game, and suddenly, it would be an extended wait. I personally think this is more proof that you should never get hyped for a game. After all, Blizzard already had collected hundreds of millions of dollars from their loyal fans. At this point, they basically had their fans' attention being held hostage. These people had invested time for the game the development team had been promising, and yet when it came time for the game to actually release, a lot of those promises were nowhere to be found. I will never again get interested in a game until I see how it's actually handled upon release. The fact that so many AAA games are released broken is a travesty considering how much money they make off their fans. Sorry for the side rant, just really bugs me how hard they misled anyone. It would be like if the Titanic was lured into hitting the iceberg on the back of false promises. Also, Jack could have fit on the door with Rose. It's been over 20 years and it still makes me angry she let him drown. Anyways, back to Overwatch 2. The closer the game to release, the more things that were promised were taken off the table. Instead, when Overwatch 2 released, it was just a glorified patch that shouldn't have been treated like a different game at all. One of the huge boosts Overwatch 2 was going to have is the fact it was shifting to a free-to-play model. This should have done a lot to really promote more activity in the game for the player count and help it hit the mainstream once again. However, upon release, there was another card waiting to drop for everyone that had been excited. We all know that the free with microtransaction model has become standard in gaming. And while all gaming companies have to make money to stay open, Overwatch 2 took this model and dialed it to the extreme. Almost everything in Overwatch 2 is locked behind a paywall of some sort. If you want the latest hero without a long grind, you have to pay for the Battle Pass. If you want the best skins offered, you have to pay for the Battle Pass, while previously there were ways to grind for points to unlock skins and loot boxes. Most of these were removed from the sequel. Basically, the second Overwatch 2 was released. It was clear all this was meant to be was a way to squeeze the loyal players for as much money as possible. The day Overwatch really died was October 4th, 2022, the day the sequel was released. The broken promises became apparent, and the launch itself was a massive failure. You would think after 3 years of development, the sequel would have been prepared for its launch. Instead, millions of players launched into queues that would last for hours on the day of launch. On top of that, before you even could earn the privilege of waiting in a nearly endless queue, you had to register your account with a phone number. This was obviously meant to help reduce smurfing and griefing, but left tons of players without any way to access their game. The only phone numbers that were accepted were from carriers with contracts. No VoIP or prepaid phones were accepted. While this idea was pretty stupid and short-sighted on behalf of Blizzard, you would think that locking thousands of players out of the servers would help the long queue times, but it didn't. People still had insanely long waits before they were even able to enter the game. Let's pretend that somehow you were able to actually get into the game near the time of launch. You were met with a gameplay experience that really sucked compared to the original. It felt like the fun parts of the games were stripped out of the experience, and the streamlined version Blizzard delivered totally lacked any personality. It doesn't help that a lot of their so-called quality of life improvements didn't actually improve anything for people who actually played the game. For example, they removed levels outside of the Battle Pass entirely, the borders that signal how long you've played the game, the on-fire system, the arcade incentives, player reputation, the find a group feature, and the endgame summary. None of these were things people were actively complaining about, and all of it helped make the game feel a bit more entertaining. Somehow, over the course of 3 years, the only development that had been done for Overwatch 2 was removing things from the game. The PvE mode they had promised was literally nowhere to be found, and while originally they promised it would come out one day down the line, just 2 years later, they announced the entire thing was cancelled due to poor sales. Which is just insanely stupid for a few reasons. But the biggest beef I have with this is that they were the ones who promised a PvE mode for years while they were developing the sequel. No one put a threatening sticky note on their door saying they had to. It was a choice Blizzard made to promise a PvE mode to everyone interested in the sequel. And then when it released with no PvE mode, they were flabbergasted. People were upset about the lack of the mode. The only reason anyone was upset about it missing was the fact that you promised it in the first place. It just goes to show how out of touch the Overwatch team is to not understand why the sales dip so hard. No one wants to play or pay for a game where all of the promises from the development team are hollow. Blizzard baited everyone for years about how the PvE mode would eventually be coming, just to totally scrap the idea once the franchise was rightfully abandoned. You can't just lie to all your players for years and expect them to keep loyally supporting your grift. They cancelled Hero Mode, cancelled the Overwatch League, cancelled PvE. Pretty much everything they promised for the sequel ended up in the trash can, just like their revenue has with these dropping player numbers. But even as much as the broken promises sucked, it still isn't the end of the list of problems Overwatch 2 has had. Any game that wants to be taken seriously in the modern era has to have some level of a developed professional scene. It is what allows players to really focus on building their career around the game, and usually the most loyal fans of a franchise are also those who play competitively on some level. First, they totally destroyed the way competitive worked by reworking the ranking system in a way most people don't enjoy. Changing from the ELO score to a pretty random card system that is insanely frustrating didn't do much to bring more players into the competitive side of things. The way the game works now in competitive, you really are incentivized to play as few matches as possible. The less games you play, the more likely you are to be able to actually climb up the ladder, which is totally the opposite of how people really want a ranked system to work. They also did themselves no favors by totally blowing up the Overwatch League as well. The Overwatch League was an insanely ambitious esports project. Teams had to invest millions of dollars to even get their slots in the league, and the system focused on having teams that existed in a certain hometown market. Honestly, it was a pretty cool idea, but when Overwatch 2 released and was much less popular than Blizzard was expecting, it suddenly didn't seem like the best business move to tie millions of dollars into franchises linked heavily to a dying game. It was rumored that franchise fees were up to $20 million. That is a large chunk of change to tie into a game that barely averages 25k players a day. Even though the investment may not have been paying off, it was important that if Blizzard wanted the long-term success of Overwatch 2, that they keep the competitive scene alive. Especially if the Overwatch League was ever going to turn a profit, it was important not to give up on the professional scene. Even larger on the overall esports side, it was important the Overwatch League succeed to show that investing in video games is worthwhile for investors. Instead, Blizzard pulled the plug on the Overwatch League and set back esports as an investment by a solid decade. Their reasoning for pulling the plug was that they didn't believe that the game had a long-term future, which isn't wrong. But the game could have had a long, successful future if Blizzard hadn't decided to light the Overwatch world on fire. Just so you folks at Activision are aware, arson is illegal and you wasted a perfectly good piece of gaming for no reason. The teams each had to pay around $20 million to get a slot in the league, and when Activision pulled the plug, they were paid a $6 million termination fee, meaning that after years of having to pay for player salaries, they lost an additional $14 million as owners of the teams. So within a year of launch, they destroyed the PvE hopes, destroyed their competitive scene, their professional scene, and on top of it, based the entire game economy around microtransactions that force players to continuously shell out money on the game. Usually if a game goes through a rough patch, it is because they managed to piss off a certain area of their core fanbase. Overwatch managed to make every single one of their fans pissed off over the course of a month. You can't make every single one of your fans mad and then wonder why the game isn't doing well. Sometimes, with games like this, somehow the studio launches a crappy game but still delivers massive profits. Overwatch 2 was actually so spectacularly bad that it hasn't even managed to generate anywhere near as much money as it was supposed to. Blizzard is a company that usually ties employee bonuses to how financially successful the game employees are assigned to is. For example, if you work on World of Warcraft and you have a gangbusters quarter, you would get a bonus. So far, over the entirety of Overwatch 2, almost no bonuses have been given to the development team. Blizzard is an absolutely massive company, and even they are starting to realize they are up a crappy creek without a paddle when it comes to the state of Overwatch. I can say I pay close attention to the gaming space as I've worked in the space for most of my adult life, and I have never seen a franchise destroy goodwill this quickly and efficiently ever. Usually, if a launch is this disastrous, the game is ruined forever and never had a huge fan base to begin with. Overwatch went from a game most people respected to a total laughingstock almost overnight. It really was a game that had an extremely loyal fan base that were willing to play the game even with its prominent issues, and as the time has gone on, even that loyal fan base has been forced to abandon this sad excuse for a sequel because it is never going to be what it once was. But is there any prospective hope for the franchise? Is there any way they would be able to turn around this absolute train wreck of a situation they are currently in? The answer is maybe, but it's going to be a long shot. I think Activision and Blizzard are both companies that are past their prime. Blizzard at one point was one of the most beloved developers on the planet, but ever since they were acquired by Activision, they have turned into one of those gaming companies that couldn't care less about the games they are releasing as long as they turn a profit. At first, I was optimistic that Blizzard's culture would be able to change some of the approaches Activision takes, but it was the other way around. Activision is known as one of those companies that cares more about money than any other aspect of gaming, and unfortunately, they've turned Blizzard into the exact same thing. That being said, currently Microsoft is attempting to purchase both Activision and Blizzard in a bid to build out their game development side of their business. Microsoft isn't necessarily known for being the nicest company on the planet, but if this acquisition comes into place, then I could see Microsoft treating Blizzard and Activision as separate developers. This would allow Blizzard to possibly rebuild some of the culture that made them great in the first place and separate from the Activision way of doing business. Microsoft is going to want quality titles in place and are also going to want to get a return on their investment. Turning around a franchise with the potential of Overwatch could lead to billions of dollars in returns for Microsoft. I also think Microsoft realizes that Activision Blizzard are in a position where everything is starting to fall apart. So part of the strategy for the acquisition centers around rebuilding the franchise they've so efficiently destroyed over the last few years. They have potential to rebuild Call of Duty, Overwatch, and every other brand that Activision currently owns. And if they can transform even a few back into the titans they once were, it would be considered a brilliant investment for Microsoft's gaming division. This is one spot where I think Overwatch 2 has the opportunity to make some ground back up. Now don't get confused, there is no way I think Overwatch 2 will be able to get back to the size Overwatch was at its peak, but I do think there is a path back to more than 20,000 players a day. So many people agree that Overwatch has tons of potential, people love the lore, people love the characters, and people love the core idea of the gameplay. It's just really lost its path in terms of implementation. If they can get back on the right track, it is totally possible that they can make up some ground and get back to 75,000 active players a day. I would be more than willing to give the game another try if they actually implemented the changes needed. Overwatch 2 has been a disaster in its current state. They destroyed a franchise that at one point had some of the most loyal fans in gaming, and a majority of its problems were self-inflicted. I can't help but think of the meme where the guy is riding the bike before sticking an object in the spokes of his tire and flipping himself over. All they had to do was keep pedaling the bike and make the promises they committed to a reality, and somehow they managed to totally ruin the golden goose opportunity they had in front of them. The last thing I want to talk about that they really dropped the ball on was just their communication overall. We can all agree as gamers that AAA studios dropping games with broken releases is very annoying, but we can also agree that we understand things happen. I am willing to overlook certain bugs and balancing issues if the studio is communicating. It's something they're working on and are aware that it exists. I think most people at the end of the day want to be reasonable and get that things in games have to be fixed by a real person. The problem with Overwatch 2 is that they keep promising things they can't deliver on and putting their foot in their mouth. When I was writing this script, one thing kept popping out to me. 90% of this game's issues are because the team overpromised things they weren't actually capable of doing. No one forced the development team to promise that competitive was going to work perfectly in the sequel, yet they set expectations for perfection. Nobody expected PvE to work perfectly on day one, but the development team just had to make that promise. When you are a company in charge of developing a game, it is your responsibility to set community expectations. The community really won't expect things you don't promise them, but Overwatch can't help but promise the world to everyone while delivering nothing but garbage. A huge step Overwatch could make toward fixing the game would be to just stop lying to your remaining fanbase about anything. Don't pretend the game is in a good state. Don't pretend that the next patch is going to fix everything. Just honestly communicate with the people who support your game. It's not like the community is as big as it used to be. You really just need to manage community expectations honestly, and for the love of God, stop promising things you aren't going to be able to do. Every time you do that, the game is going to die 1% more and you don't have a lot of health points left. Overall, I am very disappointed in the current state of Overwatch. It really was a great franchise that had a ton of potential to have a major resurgence with Overwatch 2. Sadly, corporate greed and broken promises have left fans disappointed at every turn and drastically reduced the amount of money the game makes overall. If Overwatch can just return to its roots, deliver what they promised, and stop lying to their fans, there is a huge opportunity for them to bounce back and become the game they were always capable of being. I think the fans would welcome a savior of Overwatch with open arms, and I'm hopeful the game coming under new ownership may actually get it back on the right track. Thank you all so much for watching this video about the day Overwatch died. We make gaming documentaries once a week here on Poseidon Films and are really trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. If you like this video and want to help us get there, be sure to subscribe with notifications on. We'd also really appreciate it if you press the like button. It helps the video do better in the algorithm. And if you made it this far, comment Smelly Sombra down below so we know who actually is paying attention. Our last upload was about the disastrous downfall of Call of Duty, and it's on screen now, so be sure to give it a watch. Thank you for watching the video. Have a great day.